Good afternoon. My name is William Dell, and I'm presenting on the role of emergency management in planning and mitigating climate change and sea level rise. Emergency managers use all available resources to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from the effects of all hazards. There are four fundamental phases of emergency management, being mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. The first step being mitigation because it occurs before the emergency or disaster. This step eliminates and reduces the probability of occurrence and includes actions to postpone, dissipate, or lessen the effects of the disaster. When it comes to this phase, all types of disasters are considered: earthquakes, flooding, fires, etc., whatever you can think of. Worldwide, the worst of these disasters is flooding. With global rising sea levels steadily increasing, city officials in coastal areas are beginning to see the dangers of rising tides. Storms such as Hurricane Sandy in New York open the eyes of many to the dangers of flooding in areas where they don't often see catastrophic flooding events. According to the Climate and Ocean Variability, Predictability, and Change project, which is a core project of the World Climate Research Program, their studies show that the pre-industrial era sea levels have risen over 2 meters, which is roughly 6.5 feet. Their data shows that within the next century, sea levels could rise between 3.3 and 3.7 meters, which is about 11 to 12 feet. This data is based on thermal expansion, ocean dynamics, glacier melt, ice sheet contributions, land water storage, non-climactic local sea level change, gravitational effects on sea level. Some really in-depth science, so it's pretty rock solid information. If you want to learn more, you can go to their winter 2018 volume 16 release on rising sea levels. The rising sea level brings a new meaning to the phrase impending doom. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, it generated a storm surge of 2.8 meters, about 9.5 feet, somewhere around there. Flooding damaged 650,000 buildings. Roads, bridges, subways, they were all shut down. Nearly 50 million square meters of New York City and over 400,000 residents that live there are within New York City's 100-year floodplain, or rather, they have a higher risk of a once-in-a-100-year type of storm striking, which is a departure from... It used to be a roughly 500-year floodplain until within the last 100 years. So on one end of the spectrum, you have New York City, who are not accustomed to dealing with disastrous flooding. City officials have begun investing into programs to strengthen their infrastructure and mitigate flooding damage, as Hurricane Sandy demonstrated just how vulnerable they were to water damage. So switch gears from New York City, Miami, Florida. Residents in Miami, Florida, and city officials are worried about the rising sea level as well. Of the nearly 6 million people who live in South Florida, according to The Guardian, roughly half of them live, less than 6.5 feet above the current high tide line. If we were to see a rise in sea levels of nearly 3.7 meters, you can kiss South Florida and its 6 million residents goodbye. In both of these locations, New York City, Miami, on completely opposite ends of the East Coast of the continental United States, planners and emergency managers have taken notice, and they're working to implement adaptation strategies to make their infrastructure more resilient of future flooding. It is important that emergency managers look into investment of these strategies and work towards improving infrastructure, as millions are currently at risk, and they're at risk of being completely displaced by rising sea levels within the next century. Whether it's building high seawalls to block the water from reaching beyond the shores or having a more effective drainage systems in place to combat the encroaching seawater, the next few decades of study and planning will determine if tens of millions of people's property and lives can be preserved, and to prevent some of the worst disasters from occurring. Emergency managers, this is their area. This is their bread and butter. So, emergency management, their role in all of this is what it always is. They need to mitigate. They need to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from effects of hazards. So, rising sea levels posing a larger flood threat to any coastal areas is very important that they start looking into these mitigation strategies, these ways to combat this kind of flooding. I'm William Dell, and this has been my presentation on the role of emergency management in planning, mitigating climate change and rising sea levels.